Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Emily Richmond. I'm the public editor of the Education Writers Association. I want to say first how much I appreciate the invitation from the TREP Project to be part of this important conversation. I also want to say that we're obviously convening during an extraordinary time for our nation. We have both protests as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, which are having an impact on our students and school communities, even if the bricks and mortar campuses remain closed. I'm going to be asking our presenters today to share some insights with an eye toward that important context a little bit later in this conversation. We're joined today by educators with a wide range of experience and expertise around social emotional learning. Margaret Beal Spencer is a professor of urban education at the University of Chicago. Kathleen Beachboard is an 8th grade teacher and department chair for her school in Fauquier County, Virginia. Matthew Bortel is an elementary school principal in Nashville. And David Adams is Director of Social Emotional Learning at Urban Assembly. To help frame our conversation, I wanted to share some recent work by my colleagues on the education beat, as well as some relevant research. In a survey last year by the Education Week Research Center, most teachers, 78%, said that they agree that helping students develop strong social and emotional skills is part of their job. But only about half of them, 54%, believed that they were good at doing that important work. And an even smaller share, 40%, said they had adequate solutions and strategies to use for students who lack strong skills in these areas. The top 3 challenges teachers said they face are limited time, given the need to cover so much academic content, lack of support from families, and inadequate preparation and training. Also last year, there was polling data from the education journal Education Next, which looked to gauge the priority parents and educators place on academic performance when compared with social and emotional learning. Across all areas, parents and teachers by ethnic group, as well as Republican and Democrat, more than 60% of the respondents said academic performance should be the top priority. When we talked with Harvard education professor Marty West, he's the editor of this journal, about these findings, this was his takeaway. He said, quote, "To the extent that the push for social emotional learning is seen as an effort to downplay academic instruction or excuse a lack of student learning, it's going to encounter headwinds." So how can educators better position themselves and their students to succeed academically with an eye towards social emotional learning and good mental health? And how might they elevate it as a priority in the coming academic year, which, while we don't know exactly what it's going to look like, we can expect to be tumultuous? That's what our panelists are here to discuss, and I'm looking forward to hearing their perspective on this crucial topic. I've asked them to share some brief framing remarks, and I'd like to start with Margaret Beal Spencer. Margaret, you have the floor.
Thank you. Today's forum provides an opportunity to emphasize the variability in human vulnerability and to emphasize authentic strategies for effectively supporting trauma-exposed students. Humans are vulnerable because there are always tensions to manage and variations in resources, supports, and protective factors. Especially for students of color, the character of coping with the dual assault of a global pandemic, and yet another public lynching of a Black citizen requires forceful and self-reflective attention by us. Unfortunately, too many adults will launch COVID-19 focused studies to demonstrate and publish studies about how far behind students have fallen. That is a focus on deficits. The emphasis itself may be narrow, short-sighted, and problematic for fostering a proactive health, education, and social science agenda. Plan on in the future numerous social special journal issues and edited volumes that are focused on deficits and particularly learning gaps. No surprises there, except that my 6-year-old granddaughter could estimate the outcomes for 90%, 95% of the planned studies. In fact, the deficit-focused approach will garner more resources for the investigator than training dollars for teachers and other youth-serving professionals in the health, education, and youth-supported services fields. Alternatively, as a human development, acknowledging, and justice perspective, we highlight Yes, downsides of this global pandemic and minority individual lynching as a national travesty, but also to step into the need to step into our students' moccasins and identify strengths obviously present and which need to be built upon. Also critical is the inclusion of context features making constructive changes as viewed from the families and the community's perspectives. Suggested are collaboratively designed interventions and supports, which are developmentally appropriate, culturally consonant, and powerfully sufficient for obtaining resiliency. That is, innovations for obtaining good outcomes in the presence of structured injustices and intergenerational risks. Anything less is ambulance chasing. It fails transferability into action and are not experienced as supportive. The evident impatience that you hear in my voice is knowing that too many students and families embody narrowly as problems and challenges, in fact, have frequently demonstrated remarkable intergenerational resilience and persistence. My point is that it is not solely what the researcher, service provider, teacher, or programmer sees as supportive, helpful, and resiliency promoting, but stridently emphasized should include how communities conceptualize assets and supports. Anything less is patently narcissistic. The viewpoint of shared human vulnerability has been made transparent by COVID-19 and witnessed around the globe. Its morbidity and mortality remains evident independent of skin color, ethnicity, nationality, gender, SES, immigration status, zip code. However, given the problem of socially under-acknowledged intergenerational and persistent challenge and risks, some groups with greater burdens and less protections, including inequality of asset access, were hit hardest by COVID-19. Remember that heretofore, too many of us assumed that vulnerability meant risk alone, and we identified it with others, usually unlike the self. But the disease has demonstrated and made clear that vulnerability represents both the presence of risk and challenge, but also strengths, protective factors, and supports which matter. Thus, culturally consonant, developmentally appropriate, and authentic programming may decrease acute levels of trauma and impact socio-emotional factors of learning. In essence, the everyday high level of vulnerability status linked with the public execution and symbolic lynching of yet another Black citizen for too many, trauma has now taken an acute status, thus requiring exponential levels of support. Accordingly, given classic reparation estimates by Randall Robinson and others, plus adding an earned interest on same, combined would prove still inadequate, given the supports actually needed for reversing intergenerational economic battery and physical harm. Inferred from the multi-ethnic demonstrations evident both around the nation and globe suggests a timeliness for reconciliation efforts. Effective supports require acknowledging, repairing, and fixing the human ecology and problematic systemic policies as context of socio-emotional learning and development. Thus, remedies require attention to those who have been victims of systemic inequities, as well as those who have passively functioned as silent witnesses. That is, as victims to and silent perpetrators of inequitable conditions. The dual emphasis as an anti-trauma remedy increases the potential for restorative justice, reconciliation, or authentic change. Without an interest convergence orientation, resistance, unrealism, and lost opportunity result. The next conversation after this panel will include my sharing innovative programming helpful for offsetting unaddressed and stable long-term injustices. As strategies, anything less suggests that we are chasing COVID-19 dollars and neither self-reflecting on our own contributions to others' acute trauma, nor innovating supports. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Matthew Portell, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you. And Margaret, I just want to appreciate all of the words you said. And really, it is the basis of everything that my school has been attempting to do over the last several years. And I think yesterday I was behind about 10,000 people led by 4 students of Metro Nashville Public Schools that were 14 to 16-year-olds that marched through the streets of Nashville, Tennessee. And I couldn't have felt more proud as an educator to watch the empowerment of our kids to what my goal is when every kid leaves my school is to find their voice, because that's what it is. But going back to all of those recommendations and ideas and research that you just spoken to, I think we have to get past just the social and emotional development as a key of a piece of education when we know for a fact we produce human beings. We are social and emotional, and it's the foundation of education. It's the basis of everything we do. And then you layer the impacts of trauma, both historical, generational, and into the epigenetic pieces of the impacts of trauma. We know we have to, what I call myself, we have to disrupt the system. We have to be unapologetic disruptors for the sake of our kids. In my school, we started a journey, and must I add, and I'm sure there's people listening from my school district, that I would say we started the journey without permission. We started it with a cause and a purpose. And that cause and purpose came out of the need of identifying what we were doing to kids definitely wasn't what we should be doing for kids. And I think we've gotten away as educators of understanding that this isn't solely about academic outcome. And the research and the data that Emily gave, about 60% of educators believe that is the primary focus. It is, but it has to be equally measured with the social, emotional health and development of our kids. So I do want to tell a little bit about my school because I'm a proud principal, and you can see that in my hashtag that I use almost daily, is I am in an urban school in the south side of Nashville in a very gentrified area. And I will tell you, for the sake of being professional, sometimes Nashville is referred to the it city, right? But we have to be cautious because sometimes you got to add the sound in front of that for some of our kids. And I say that professionally because what I've seen happen to my city with economic growth that is unbelievable has impacted my community, my school community immensely. And we were seeing homelessness. We were seeing all kinds of impact economically on our school, but also the social and emotional health of my students. And I can tell you that after my first year of school, I was engaging in practices that I had a paradigm shift. And I know we're going to get to that conversation later, where I realized what I was doing, what I was trained to do as a principal in principal school and in my principal mentorships, it wasn't what I should have been doing. That kids were coming with insurmountable trauma, and we have to understand the impact of that on what people call behavior. I call it communication. That when we see behaviors for kids, all that is a form of communication. And coming through this disruptive time of COVID and the social rights movement of our time, and seeing these impacts that are happening, and even in Nashville, 2 days before the COVID crisis, we were hit by a tornado. So the impacts have been great on my city. And I understand that when there's disruption, there's an opportunity to come back stronger when we challenge the status quo, when we start getting innovative. But there's also this urge and need to come back at the status quo. We as educators have to understand that we're in an opportunity gap right now of challenging what we've done that doesn't work, pushing the envelope for our kids, our communities, all of our kids, all of our communities, and making this work about what it is, and that's human beings, and that's who we work with. I'm in the human business. I'm not in the data business. Data is important, data is valid, but it is 100% about human beings and children.
Thank you very much, Matthew. A lot of food for thought there. Kathleen Beachford, classroom teacher, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Hi, I have a couple of slides. The first slide, there we go. Okay, wait, there we go. Okay, so I'm a middle school teacher, and basically every year I see more kids with anxiety, depression, and trauma. And I had one of them who was in the foster care system actually commit suicide. And after that, I decided I was going to do something about it. So I adopted a sibling group of 5 kids who went through one of the most extreme cases of abuse and neglect in our entire state, because those kids who get older in the foster care system don't get adopted. So I adopted a family of 5, as you see them in the corner. That's my lovely 7 children. And I was told when I adopted them that having ACE scores of 9 and 10, they'd forever be impacted. They're going to have a horrible life. That you pretty much have a little neuroplasticity and they're set. Sorry. And I wasn't going to accept that. I was tired of seeing my students die. I was tired of seeing what they think of children who have trauma. And so I wanted better outcomes for the kids who've experienced trauma, my own and my students. And I decided to do something about it. So as a classroom practitioner, one of the biggest things that I did is I went on a search. I wrote a book. I've written many articles, and I'm tired of seeing SEL being put aside as something extra we have to do when it's the foundation of what we have to do as educators, because we are people. They're going to go out in the world and they're going to interact with people. And if we think academics are the top thing that we have to do, that's not it. We're supposed to build on the foundation and strength of our children. Even the word education comes from the word educe, which means to draw forth. We're supposed to be drawing forth the strengths of our children, not downplaying them because they have deficits. Everyone has deficits. And it just drives me crazy that because something happened to a kid, even with an IEP, one of my own children has an IEP, they get labeled, they get put in a system, and they are forever supposed to be stuck there. And that is not what we are supposed to do. So I went through and I basically wanted to get out there that one of the things that we have to do with SEL or anything else is Maslow is before Bloom. So we have to create a foundation of safety. Safety has to come first for these kids. And that foundation of safety on the next slide that you'll see is based off of cognitive behavioral therapy, because my kids, I've been trained in everything from mental health, first aid, cognitive behavior therapy. I've had all the trainings, and that's because I want what's best for my students and my own children. And so some of the things that Margaret pointed out, having consistency, control, and communication can be done in a classroom very easily and very quickly. And I just want to bring these up. Co-creation of rules and procedures. You don't know the background of all of your students and saying, this is what you have to do. These are the rules you have to follow. That's just putting in place systematic issues and also racial issues. So we need to co-create. We need to work together and show them that cooperation is the foundation of what we should be doing as a society. So co-creating rules and procedures, and then setting it up and letting students have a voice, because a lot of the times we don't let them. And then self-care plans. That's something that I do with my students on day 1. I have them create a plan based off of their own resources for their own mental health. Like, what things you do that make you feel better? And then we plan for bad days. If we have fire drills, why aren't we having self-care plans and self-care drills to let these kids know, hey, you're going to have bad days. Here's what you can do about it. We need to have that set in place. And then also mental health check-ins. It can be done in 5 seconds. Like, I use a Google form, checking in with the kids, and not just them, their families. They need that. It's a foundation of safety. And it also shows that we are there more than just to educate them. We're there for them as people, and that we care about them as individuals. And when we help the families, we help the kids. And the future of COVID-19 might be uncertain, but the mental health of our students shouldn't be. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. And now, last but certainly not least, we have David Adams from Urban Assembly. David.
Thank you, Emily. I appreciate it. Just want to give a quick shout out here to Matt. I was over in Chattanooga, in Hamilton, Clark County, back in March, and had some great whiskey. Took it home, and I've been appreciating it under COVID. So thank you from Tennessee to New York. I appreciate your whiskey and things that you guys are doing there over in Chattanooga. So I guess I'm going to talk a little bit today about this notion. And Emily, you brought this idea up around what is the purpose of education, right? How do we balance these priorities in education? And so the way I think about this is I ask myself this question, right? What does it mean to be educated? How would we understand? How do we know a person is educated? And the way I think about this is that for me, the purpose of education, the way that we could tell somebody is educated, is because they are able to solve problems and contribute to their community. So these are the two aspects of quality education to me. And so I look around and I look at some of our folks who are representatives, some of our folks who are trying to solve problems on behalf of society, but who are failing. And these folks graduated from the finest institutions that America and other countries have to offer. And so if you cannot solve problems, not only on the technical domains, right? Not only can we create a vaccine for COVID, but can we help people understand their responsibility to a larger community? Those are both problems that we need to solve in order to be effective as a society. And so when we think about the purpose of education, right, we think about what people know, who they are, and what they need to be. So I think about it as be, know, do. Be, who are you? Know, what do you need to know? And then do, what do you do with that knowledge, right? And so social and emotional development is an explicit and foundational aspect if we are looking to produce people who can contribute to their society and solve problems. If we are producing young people who are going to live in a multicultural world, who will need to speak across difference, who will need to take the perspectives of people who are not themselves, who look different, who have different experiences, and we're asking them to keep our nation as a cohesive understanding of who we are, then we need to invest in the social and emotional development of our teachers and our young people if that's the outcome that we're looking to produce. All right. So I want to think about social and emotional learning as a foundation of understanding this notion of be, know, do. And then I want to think about its impact on information processing and reasoning. So people will say to me, they'll say, okay, well, we need students to be able to score well in academics. And I can guarantee you that there are people today who are very academically gifted, but because of the lack of social and emotional development, are processing information in a way that predisposes them to be manipulated by folks who are preying on emotions versus developing their reason. All right, so the librarian group, and I don't remember the exact study, but they just pulled out a study and said, all right, so we know right now that when people are trying to target people's or manipulate people's emotions, right, they're using words in articles like angry or frustrated. And those words, those trigger words, make people share information at a much higher rate because they're not actually sharing it because of what they know, they're sharing it because of what they feel. And that's fine. But I'm saying that if we are in a country that is looking to combat misinformation, if we are in a country that is looking to bring ourselves together as a cohesive whole, then a social and emotional education is the foundation of that, because what you know is not as important as what you feel, right? People need to invest in ideas and identities. And without that social emotional education, people are going to be more easily manipulated, and what they know is not going to be represented in what they do. So to close this up, I just want to think about three things. Number one is, what does it mean to be educated? And I would posit that to be educated means that we can solve problems and contribute to our communities. What does it take to solve problems? It takes understanding, it takes knowing, it takes cognitive skill, but also takes social and emotional competence, right? And then lastly, what does it mean to be part of a community, right? It means that we need young people who can listen to other folks. We need people who can take perspective. We need people who can manage their emotions, and we need people who can value people who are different from them. So those are the three things that I would think about when we're thinking about the importance of social emotional learning in the current educational context.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you all of you for your comments. And especially Margaret, I really feel like you conveyed the sense of urgency with what we're talking about here. There's never been a more important time to be a teacher, I would argue. And certainly there's possibly never been a more challenging time to be an educator in this country. So I want to just thank all of you for those very insightful and very timely comments. I do have some questions prepared, and I'm going to put this first. I'll ask Margaret as sort of from the research side to maybe share first, and then ask the rest of you to chime in. So we know social emotional learning it's a complex formula. This isn't something that can or should be done without resources, without training. If I'm coming into a school or more specifically a classroom, what am I looking for? What are some of the hallmarks of a well-structured and effective SEL plan that has a clear connection to supporting academic instruction?
I think the school needs to represent the community in terms of communicating very positive, if you will, images, because we're talking about identification. That's what kids come to school. They want to feel comfortable. They want to feel as if the school represents who they are as well, in terms of the experiences that they have navigating the spaces. People give them affirmation in terms of selfhood. So I think, going into a school where there is a clear atmosphere, welcoming atmosphere that clearly acknowledges the humanity of youngsters. And I cannot underscore that enough. And David and Matthew and Kathleen all alluded to it. I do not take it lightly, given the history of this country, when it comes to poor people, when it comes to people of color. There has been an orientation of inhumanity. So all the messages that give a child a sense, given their unavoidable ability, and I think David underscored this a lot, to take the perspective of the other, because that is what reflects onto the self. So feeling and experiencing an environment that is respectful of youngsters' humanity and affirms the recognition of that humanity, I think is real important, and that is not something that is generally experienced by young kids, both navigating space to get there and once they arrive, because the experience just getting to school. We think about little Black boys trying to go to school, and whenever they see a person who should be a law profession, a justice professional, instead, kids are getting feedback that they're not being treated as little boys going to school or young men. They're treated as frightening Black men. That is a socio-emotional assault that has implications for the questions in terms of education, what it is and how you use it, that David alluded to, and certainly Kathleen and Matthew alluded to as well. You cannot divide up kids. They're knowledge builders and possessors, so they're cognitive, they're socio-emotional people, and they're biological. So all three of those systems of humanity work together. And if we don't have context that basically communicate recognition of that multifaceted sense of one's humanity, well, then we miss opportunities.
Would anyone else like to chime in? Go ahead, Kathleen.
So Valerie Mahome from Yale University did a study with marginalized students in California. And what she did was she concentrated on the social emotional impacts. And what she did is she used the attributional style questionnaire, which measures a student's hope score and optimism. And would you know that with the students who were in another group where they were getting remediation academically, and the other group that was getting hope and resilience training, and then they tested them again at the end of the study after a year to see how they were doing. The students who had the hope and resilience built in and scored higher on the attributional style questionnaire when they were done ended up with more academic gains than the other group. And on top of that, at the end of the study, when they were in high school, those students in this marginalized group who were expected not to go to college were some of the first kids to go to college. We're talking groups that generally would not succeed. They were pushed aside, some with IEPs and everything else. Hope and resilience and optimism and SEL push them higher than, hey, here's some academic remediation.
Thank you.
I think
Go ahead, Matthew.
To build off what Kathleen said, and I think it's imperative and it's a travesty that SEL is something else that we do. I think that what you need to see is an integrated model of where you see social and emotional development and support within every fiber of the school. For example, when the students pull up to my school, we have a team of 6 every day. I'm part of it, that welcomes the kids. Mm-hmm. It also lets us gauge where the kids are in their space, right? You can tell when a kid is upset. You can tell when they're crying. We can pull them right into the office, have a supportive conversation. That's one piece, that it has to be integrated. It has to be connected to academics. When we're talking about social and emotional development, our kids need access to text and content that look like them, that we can't just separate this as being identifying emotions in those times. It's connection that we have to build for our kids. Another key is, I think, common vocabulary is really important. Being able to speak to kids with the same understanding. In my school, we use something that's called the leader in me. It's the 7 habits of highly effective people. Every kid in the building understands what those 7 pieces are. We support. And lastly, we've got to stop looking at behavior as something we punish, and we have to start looking at it as a skill gap. Dr. Ross Green is very clear in his CPS model of looking at behavior as an ability to build a skill, right? And that's where social and emotional development comes in. We can't extinguish skills that kids may not possess, right? And then lastly, I do think in the trauma-informed movement, which a lot of people argue is a deficit mindset, I disagree when we have to look at the impact of trauma. And like Kathleen, I'm actually a foster parent. I have been for 17 months, so I get exactly what you're saying. But we have to understand that we do have to have boundaries with kids. We do have to build their capacity, but it has to be done with support and not compliance. So there's so many aspects to a good social and emotional environment rich school, where it's not just the physical space, but it's the purpose that's operated in every single day.
Go ahead, Margaret.
And just to build on Matthew's point, I think it's really important to note, because I think, again, David hammered away at this point, and that is awareness, showing social cognition, being so cognitively aware is sort of built into our humanity. You know, infants begin that process when they're born, basically beginning the process of moving from being totally ego-centered to being other people-centered, right? In order to use that information to both get their needs met, but also to allow themselves to fit into environments, which means then that for me, teachers and educators are extremely important, because kids are already pre-wired to infer, to take in information. And it's the nature of that information that is very critical. And that's why, in addition to focus on the children, I want to focus on the teachers and administrators. I think it's important to let's also fix the context. Clearly, in terms of training that all 3 of you have had, in terms of program and teaching, you already have those insights, but we've done, the studies have been done. I'm thinking of one by Tabitha D'Angelo, especially at Penn. What she showed is that the teachers as adults, to do the job that Kathleen and David and Matthew were talking about, they also need support. And that's why these are serious and important policy issues. And so what Tabitha D'Angelo found is that to the degree that teachers infer support from their leaders, from their supervisors, et cetera, that loosens them up to be more open and they're able to then be more caring and supportive of kids. And that's what kids pick up. So there is this interaction, there's this intersubjectivity, if you will, between the mental health state and sense of supports of the adults in the environment and the ability of youngsters to take advantage of those supports. They work hand in hand.
Thank you very much, Margaret. So David hinted at a question that he knew I had in my back pocket that I was hoping that folks would answer. So I am going to ask him to answer it first, which is, I'm curious how your approach to social emotional learning in relation to academic achievement has changed or evolved over the years. And if you can maybe share personal experience that influenced that shift. David.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I think there's a couple of things that we want to talk about. I think number one, the most important thing to understand is that social and emotional skills facilitate academic gains. They facilitate decision-making in life. They facilitate a student's sense of community. But all these things facilitate academic gains. So whenever we talk about this distinction between social and emotional development and academic development, that distinction is not grounded in the science, right? Learning is a social and emotional process. Kids care about information that's relevant to them. And the easiest way to make relevant information relevant, which may not be relevant on its face, like calculus, is to build relationships so that kids care about the person who's delivering that information. So at the first piece, I just want to say that social emotional learning facilitates academic development. Now, I want to say this out loud. Even if social emotional learning did not facilitate academic development, it would still be an important part of our education system. But we don't have to make that choice because we're not in that place. So the way we think about this at the Urban Assembly, as we think about social emotional learning in three ways when it comes to academic development. We think about it in terms of instructional formats. And the question here is, what type of instructional formats facilitate social and emotional development, right? And these are simple things like using cooperative learning techniques when you're fostering positive interdependence, where people need to turn take and use communication skills and then be briefed on the communication skills as well as the content in order to make the implicit explicit, right? So when you're doing a turn and talk to your neighbor, it's not just, you know, what did you say? What did you think about it? Well, it's how well did you maintain eye contact? How well did you paraphrase what the other person talked about? And how can you use these skills in your broader life? So the first thing we think about is, what are the instructional formats that facilitate social and emotional development? The next thing we talk about is, what are the social emotional skills that facilitate academic development in terms of content understanding? The most important thing to understand is that learning is a process of integrating new information into existing ways of thinking. It's a way of integrating new information into existing ways of thinking. And so what are the social and emotional skills that students need or to develop that helps that process go along? And so one of the things that we talk about here is things like self-management, things like perspective taking, things like social awareness. So when students are able to set and achieve goals, that helps their motivation. We know that, right? That's just the thing. The shorter term the goals, the more likely the students are to get motivated. The better the quality of feedback, the more students are to engage in that space. So there are things that students can learn in terms of social emotional processes that help them achieve their goals. And then the last thing we talk about is, what are the social emotional skills that teachers bring to bear that support teaching and learning in the classroom, right? And these things are really simple. These things are like, the quality of feedback is one of the most important things to learning. But quality feedback means that teachers are really paying attention to misconceptions and the thinking of students. In order to do that, you need to use perspective taking skills. When teachers are able to say, oh, I think what you did is that you thought X, and what I was actually trying to get you to think about was Y, it means that the teacher has watched the student, has paid attention to how they're approaching the problem, and has talked back to the student about their thinking processes that will help facilitate problem solving. That is a skill of the teacher to speak from the student's perspective of how they're trying to solve that problem, right? Think about the difference between getting a math problem back that just says X and a math problem back that says, oh, this is the misconception that you had. Let's talk about this in terms of facilitating that. So that's one piece. The other piece is, how are teachers' social and emotional processes impacting the way they organize the environment, right? We talk to teachers and they say things like, man, you know, I really want to use, for example, flipped classroom, or I really want more student-centered dialogue, but I'm afraid of losing control, right? But that's not the students, that's the teacher, right? That's me being afraid of losing control. So my social and emotional processes as a teacher are impacting the ability of my students to engage in high quality instruction. And then the last one here from the teacher's perspective is just a simple thing like wait time. Like, we've always been pushing our teachers, all right, we need to increase our wait time, which is the amount of time between when a teacher asks the question to when a student can respond. We push for about 5 to 10 seconds. And teachers say to me, you know, oh, it makes me feel really anxious when my students are responding. Like, that anxiety is self-awareness, but that's not the student's issue. That's the teacher's issue, right? So my development of the teacher being to say, all right, I want you to sit with that, because you're going to invite students to respond if you give them more time to think. That's a process that is related to the social emotional development of teachers. So when we think about academics, we think about it from the point of teachers to students in terms of the quality of students, of the quality of social emotional processes of teachers. We think about student skills, and then we think about instructional formats overall in the classroom.
Thank you, David. I'm going to try to practice a little bit of that with my moderating skills, where I'm always trying to listen more and talk less. So I'm going to just pause for a moment. And if there's anyone else who'd like to chime in on that question, if there's an experience you'd like to share about your evolution in social emotional learning.
Well, when I adopted my 5 children, so they came from an extremely abusive home. And because of that, they had a lot of PTSD going into school. And I'll never forget the first day of school for my oldest child. He was in middle school, went to school, came home crying. He had a referral because a teacher yelled at him, and he immediately got under his desk and covered his head because that was a trauma response from what happened to him. And we immediately go to discipline for these kids who've experienced trauma, and they're just using coping mechanisms they have to survive. And so SEL needs to go beyond just, hey, here's a normal kid giving them SEL needs. Those kids who've experienced trauma, brains in pain can't learn. And so we have to address the trauma as well as build on that. So SEL needs to be differentiated based off of students' needs, just like a classroom lesson. We need to meet kids where they are. So for my child, I had to go in, I had to explain the background that he was coming from to the teacher. And I already did once, but she didn't understand that the trauma doesn't just go away when you change the environment. It's something they lived with and they grew up with it. And because of that, the teacher ended up, changing her practices and learning about trauma-informed practices. And it's necessary, because if you look at the ACE study that was done before COVID-19, 50%, that's almost half of the students in our nation have experienced some sort of trauma. Now with COVID, we're talking, it's even more. And the Kaiser Foundation just recently did a poll with adults, and it said 56% of the adults polled, and it was thousands of adults, said that this has majorly impacted their mental health. If our students are not being able to use their parents, who are their main mental support and guidance, they're going to come to school and look to us. And like Margaret pointed out, we also need to make sure that secondary trauma and traumatic stress for educators is focused in on, because we're going to be dealing with an onslaught of a mental health crisis. And we have to make sure the teachers are okay. Because I'm going to tell you, when I adopted my 5 kids with all the trauma they've had, it killed me, because there were some days I was doing everything right and they were just not okay. And that's not me. It's because of how they grew up. And I have to take a step back sometimes and just realize, there has to be support. We have to support each other. And that's where SEL comes into place, because it can't just be a one-time thing. It has to be all the time. We have to help each other. You can even look at what's going on right now. People need to collaborate more. We need to build together. And we also need to learn more about each other. Everything from our own implicit biases, from how we grew up, to looking at trauma-informed practices. The more we know, the more power we have to help our students.
Thank you, Kathleen. Matthew.
If you don't mind, I'm over here. I'm trying not to get all fired up when I hear you all speak, but I'm resonating so much. And I can tell you my paradigm shift. It was an instant moment where I was a classroom teacher that believed in community. I had great classroom community. I was an instructional coach that knew the power of relationships. But when I became a principal, things tended to shift for some weird reason. And I don't know honestly why. I guess I think I was overwhelmed by what Kathleen was alluding to, and even what Margaret and David. This is 100% about adults right here. When we're talking about skill building, it's about us and how we manage and how we construct our lessons and the strategies we use. It's also about something called co-regulation, which is me staying calm in a moment where the child is not, right? It's that space of being there in the present for our kids. But the moment that happened for me, I was at a Barbara Gay lecture, which is a historic lecture here in Nashville at Vanderbilt University. And I was exposed to these things called ACEs, and that's been several years ago. And I remember in that moment of having an absolute paradigm shift, of realizing, oh my goodness, I may actually be hurting children emotionally. And this is for somebody who I have valued and loved and invested in social and emotional development of all of my students from when I started teaching. And then I think it's progressed to understand that we have to get way beyond the ACE study. We have to get way beyond the ACE score. We have to look at systemic racism. We have to look at systemic issues. We have to look at historical context of schools. We have to look at our behavior policies. I think there's so many pieces that we have to keep going back and reevaluating. But I can tell you that moment that I heard a neuroscientist from Vanderbilt and an assistant principal talk about what trauma was, I was blown away. And I think what I always backed up to, it was poverty. We only talked about poverty, and we read books on poverty, but it was a stereotype. It was a misconception that only kids who were from a low socioeconomics had trauma. We know now that it goes through all communities, no matter what socioeconomics that they may be in.
Thank you, Matthew. David, did you want to just close out with something?
Yes, just briefly. I just wanted to reorient this to Margaret's opening comments about the importance of protective factors and resilience. That there are strengths in our communities, and there are strengths in our relationships. And I think we need to orient ourselves to building schools so that they are protective factors, as opposed to thinking about inflicting trauma, right? So at the end of the day, we need to sit down and say, have I done everything that I can to make sure that the students who walk through my school is coming out of here with high quality relationships, with strong interactions, because I want to contribute to that student's growth. I want to contribute to that student's resilience and their protective factors. And I think that's an empowering message. That means we don't have to think about avoiding trauma, because if we are emphasizing protective factors, then you won't be traumatizing kids. So I just wanted to throw that out as a frame that I think empowers us to do right by our children in our communities.
And I know we got to move on, but David, I think it's really important. And I think when you're talking trauma informed, this isn't about kids with trauma, right? It's operating in a way for all kids, understanding what you just said, and you said it so articulately, and I appreciate it, because that is the scope of the work. It's creating safe environments that value relationships. Thank you for stating that.
Thank you very much. So I had the opportunity of a conversation with Sean Harper, who is an education professor who's now at USC. And he and I were having a conversation about some of the challenges facing the nation's teacher workforce when it comes to cultural competency and being prepared to help students understand their home life experiences and how those carry over to their academic work. And he said something really interesting to me, and he said, you can't teach a child if you're afraid of that child. And that to me was a light bulb moment. And he was absolutely right. And it's not that every teacher is afraid of every child, but certainly we have a nation where teachers workforce, the vast majority of them are white, and the vast majority of them are women, well over 80%. And I'd like to just hear, given some of those statistics, what specific advice do you have for teachers and how they approach social emotional learning through this lens of connecting it to academic achievement, especially when it comes to working with students of color whose backgrounds and experiences may be very different from theirs, and also for those who have potentially experienced trauma? Margaret, we haven't heard from you in a little bit, so do you want to start with her?
Sure. I think this is a really important issue. I just think that given the consequences of segregation, I think people end up just living with people who look like themselves, and they carry with them, however, stereotypes that are part of those communities, but they're unacknowledged, they're not addressed. They become part of the identity that is basically manifested as very much foundationally a part of the relationship that David alluded to. And so because in terms of my work and my applications, my interest is in fixing the context, fixing the adults in the context. I think children can be fine if the context responds to them appropriately and healthfully. And I remember on a personal level, since we're telling stories, I remember, in being a young girl, I always had a sense that by third grade, I had a clear sense that teachers in that school who did not look like me also didn't expect me to be a critical thinker. And I recall once, when a teacher, thought she was doing something really great by planning to take the students on a field trip. And it was feeding her narcissism of being a very liberal person and generative person. And I had missed the day when she had introduced this field trip and shared it with the kids. And when I came back and I was told that we were having this trip, and I told my classmates, because we were in a situation we were all doing makeup work, I said, you'll like that trip. I've been there already. My mother's taken my sisters and I, and we enjoyed it, and you'll enjoy it as well. So the teacher came back in, and the kids told her, oh, Margie's already been so and so. And the teacher became very upset because I wasn't showing gratitude for her doing her job. And I think that happens so frequently, informally, that our expectations are so low of children that we're responsible for training, developing, and caring about. And there's no dissonance. This teacher had no dissonance. And for me, that was a clarion call in terms of, my not fitting neatly into the expectations of people that I was supposed to trust, look up to, and believe in as a safe source of knowledge and support. So that happened to me when I was 7, 8 years old. I've never forgotten it because that was trauma like because how I was raised, and I think that happens a lot. We know that cultural identity in a variety of ways is part of the African American family experience, church experience, and kids are developing with a sense of self. And when that sense of self is negated because of the relationship or lack thereof with a significant other, which a teacher is, I think it can be a real turnoff for some youngsters in terms of no longer trusting a school, that's responsible for their learning and development.
Thank you very much for your candor on that, Margaret. And it reminds me of something that I do sometimes in conferences, which is I ask people to raise their hand if they can name the person who taught them math in their junior year of high school. And usually about half the hands in the room go up. And then I say, can you tell me about your second grade teacher? And every single hand will go up. There's something about those early years where we're just sponges and remember it so vividly. Kathleen, I think you wanted to chime in there.
Well, sort of like what Margaret said with that story where, we have these perceptions in our mind. The one thing we have to realize is we were all raised a certain way. And I would recommend for every educator watching this that they take the Harvard implicit bias test. There are multiple implicit bias, and we all have them. And that's the first thing, is not listening, it's learning about yourself, learning what implicit biases do you have, because you have to cognizantly fight those. For example, when I was in elementary school, I was basically labeled dyslexic, and a teacher told me, you'll never learn to read a stop sign. And because of that, I started to live up to that expectation. I started failing. I wasn't doing as well as my peers. And that was an early education, it changed me. But what switched my mind is having one educator believe in me. So that goes back to, Margaret's story about the power of early education. And then also David's, how those relationships, neuroplasticity, we have the ability to change the brain at any time in our lives. And so making sure that we know those implicit biases, because that teacher saw me as labeled as special ed, so I can't do it. And that's absurd, because people can change at any time in their life. They have that power. They have that ability. And so it just drives me crazy that we have these judgments, but we need to know what they are. All of us, every person has them, because you were raised a certain way. For example, my mother was a homemaker. And so when I took the implicit bias test, it said that I saw men in the field of science. It's not that I'm, against women. Obviously, I am a woman, but that was an implicit bias I have. And I need to be cognizant of that. So when I talk to students, it doesn't come across. We need to know ourselves. We need to fix ourselves. Like Margaret said, we got to fix the adults so the kids can have the support that they need to succeed in school.
Thank you. David.
Thank you, Emily. So I really appreciate this question, because I've been thinking about this a lot, particularly given the teacher crisis in terms of shortages. It's tough to critique a field when it's hard to recruit. But I do think there are some important things that we can think about when we're thinking about social and emotional learning in a cross-cultural context. The first thing I think is that if we want kids to connect, they need to see models that reflect who they are. And if they don't have access to those models, then we need to be intentional about developing a common space in the classroom by which students and teachers share a common identity, right? So I need to show myself, and then I need to encourage my students to see that. if I want to forge something that is not kind of like natural in terms of who we are and where we come from. So I just want to say the first thing is that if we're going to be in these spaces, we need to have teachers who understand the differences between who they are and where our kids are coming from, and then be intentional about coming together and saying, let's talk about who we are in classroom 303. The second thing I think that's really important to me, particularly in the context of SEL, I was over in Chattanooga and as a deputy director, and we were just talking about the importance of asset-based framing. And so we talked about that he had gone to a trainer, and he looked at the trainer and he says, you know, I really want ads. That's like my end state. I want killer ads. And he did not have ads at the moment, but the trainer looked at him and he said, you know, we all have ads. Right now, you just have a lot of things that are covering them up. But we're gonna work on that. We're gonna pull those abs out, right? And so when we talk about social emotional development, and Margaret was referenced this earlier, we're talking about a naturally progressing developmental spectrum of skills and attitudes and approaches that our students embody and our people embody. And so our job is to make the implicit explicit. It's not to give kids social emotional skills. It's to pull those social emotional skills out so they are fluent with those skills and can use them to problem solve, right? I'm not giving my kids self-management. I am supporting my kids in developing the management and so that they can apply it to meet their own goals. So that asset-based framing is so important because I go into school sometimes and people say, you know, I've learned about SEL. I can tell you what's wrong with this kid. He doesn't have self-management. He doesn't have self-awareness. We need to fix him. We need to fix adults. We need to develop the awareness of management techniques. We need to develop the fluency in which students deploy these techniques and adults. We need to develop the awareness of the importance of contributing to the community. We're not giving them to their kids. We have ads. We just need to work it out a little bit so that we can go to the beach and everybody can comment on it. I think you're muted.
There are many unknowns about what school is going to look like this fall, but we do know that there's going to be classroom instruction of some kind, whether it's online or hopefully to some degree in person. But we also know that there are going to be many students who are dealing with the stress and trauma as a result, both of the COVID-19 pandemic, the economic fallout from that, and now these nationwide protests in response to police brutality and treatment of Black people. I'm wondering, what recommendations do you have for the educators in our audience who are thinking about the first day of school? What can they do on their own in these coming months to be in a better position to support their students when the new academic year gets underway?
I'll jump in really quick, and this is from a principal standpoint. So I will tell you, I don't think you can wait till the first day of school. And I can tell you even now, we're having discussions on getting teachers in front of students for next year, getting that familiarity, because I think connection quickly is going to be important. And I would also recommend that people go to the National Association of School Psychologists, and Dr. Eric Rosen just wrote a school reentry consideration plan on the social emotional learning and mental supports of students as they return. Some great recommendations in there, including having kids come back in a small cohort of who they left with so they can get closure to move on to the next year, right? Pieces of ideas of innovation of going, we've never had to deal with this before. But thinking about, again, in a relationship mindset, in a connection-based mindset, in order to get the transition to where kids feel safe, supported, and connected. And that is the basis. So I think even going back to making sure some of those easy pieces that just require a little bit of time, of those morning connection meetings, those pieces of buddying up systems, and many things that we do. But I also want to say we have to consider our adults. We have to consider the amount of stress that they have had to endure, and they're not going to be able to come back in spaces maybe they left. As a parent of 3 boys, I can tell you, I've realized I don't think being a stay-at-home father is for me. It's been difficult. I love my kids, but man, it's been tiresome. And a lot of our teachers do have families at home. But I also want to recommend, it's something that we've done for years, but I think it's a key for teachers. It's a system that we call the tap in and tap out system. where it's to promote co-regulation, which is that, in the words of Dr. Mary Cernabori, it's to pull kids into your calm instead of going into their storm. And it's a system in which we use GroupMe app, which is a communication app where when teachers feel dysregulated and they can't get themselves back, they can ask for somebody to step in so they can step out for a minute. These pieces of support for adults are going to be key, just as teaching these same opportunities and building on the capacity of our children is going to be the same. But I think we have to envision what we do for our adults and how we manage to bring our kids in a different way for many, not necessarily for our school, because we've invested in these things over the last 5 to 6 years, but looking at the relationship and safe, stable, nurturing relationships is the focus.
Thank you. Kathleen and then Margaret.
I feel like what you said, Matthew, about the tap in, tap out is awesome, but also having a room like that for students, like a focus and recovery room where students can go when they know, hey, I'm meeting my regulation, like I can't regulate. And so having a place that's not going to punish them, but they can go back and find that calm and then go back to learning. So, you know, because kids are going to have that trauma from everything that's been happening. And then also the idea of having advisors, you know, having a relationship where you say, this is your go-to person. They will take care of you. They are going to check in on you. I know there are a lot of students in a school. I've got 110, but having advisors for those kids where they can check in and say, hey, are you okay? And knowing they have an adult who is going to be there to make sure they get through, just like in college. That's one of the reasons I got through, you know, both of my college programs is because I had an amazing advisor who cared about me. And so having those relationships, even like what David brought up, it's super important. And just making sure mentoring is part of whatever we do. And we need to make sure that we also get more information about our students coming in. We need more information and not less. So getting families involved, like a triangle, making sure we have family support. I send this thing home to my students way before school even starts. It's called A Million Words or Less. And I ask the guardians to tell me everything they want to about the kids, everything that's good, things that work, things that don't work, because guess what? Those guardians live with them. They know more about them than I ever will. And so getting that extra leg of support, it's great because it also gives you regulation strategies that student uses in order to support them in the classroom. So you're getting started off by saying, hey, you know what, first day, I know you really like rabbits. I've got like a stuffed rabbit over there. It helps the kid. It makes them feel like you already know them, and it starts the relationship off on the right foot.
I'd like to also add that it might be important to think about changing the context, especially in areas like STEM, which it can be so more, if you will, challenging for certain kids, given all the stereotypes around the challenge of math and science learning. I've been very, very fortunate to have been in collaboration, number one, with the school system. This is Michigan City, Indiana, and a NSF-supported small business, which is a turntable company. And so we've been using the arts. We've been using, in essence, sensory embedded turntable technology to teach STEM to youngsters. And it's been a very exciting process because it's basically the arts. And kids believe that they're just having fun because they're doing something developmentally appropriate in terms of being cool, but they have no idea, except once they get into the curriculum, that they're learning math and science and coding through turntabling. So what they think is that they're having a great time and it's really cool, but they're really learning math and science. That's been very, very just exciting for me because we've been working out of turntable labs with the school system. And now, because we're into an e-learning format, they asked us to again do summer school from again this summer. And at first I was a little concerned because these kids who had been sitting in front of a monitor, so we had to go from a tactile version to an e-version online. And basically in a 2-week period, we went from, I guess, 7 kids to almost 80 kids who signed up for middle school kids who signed up for STEM summer school. And from the previous summer experiences, I can tell you, that the kids came every day and they basically, were totally engaged. And so what I'm suggesting is that we may well think about as well other formats for learning that kids view as stressful, relaxing, but manipulating music and songs, etc., provides lots of opportunities to talk about uncomfortable issues like injustice, the importance of, interacting with each other responsibly, understanding, if you will, some of the isms in the world, because music very often communicates very emotional messages. So what I'm suggesting is that perhaps using different formatting to communicate curriculum might be also very helpful.
Emily, I think you're muted.
David or Matthew, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kathleen and Margaret spoke about it very well. I can only add a couple of things. I think it really comes down to understanding what is the purpose of schools. What is the purpose of education? I think if we think that the purpose of schools is to convey discrete bodies of content and knowledge, we're going to organize our schools in a certain way. If we think that the purpose of schools is to support and produce citizens who can support our communities and problem solve, we're going to organize our schools in other ways. So I think like understanding, and I guess one of the things that's been helpful, I think in 2020, not many things have been helpful in 2020, but one of the things there's been the surge of just literature around really understanding what is the science of learning and development. I mean, we have to understand that the context of learning matters. It's just who we are. And so we can fight against who we are as humans. We can fight against, and Margaret talked about this, social, emotional, biological. We can fight against that and try and place students in unnatural conditions in order to meet the needs of our society with regards to tugging out high school graduates at a certain rate. Or we can actually care about what is it that facilitates the quality learning of our students, and then take that learning and think about what are we going to do with that learning in order to solve the problems that we need to solve as a society in order to move forward. So, I think as we're thinking about opening up schools, the feedback that I get from my students consistently is that my teachers care about me. It's really nice to have teachers who care about more than my grades. And that's not to say that we don't care about your grades, but when students are put down to a grade, then they don't feel like the only avenue to feel valued in that school is to have a 95% average. And that's not true. It's not true for our kids. It's not true for our society. It's not true for our communities. There are many ways that we value our young people, and we expect them to solve problems in terms of be able to think and demonstrate that thinking through their grades. But if these are people who can build community, if these are the people who are the future leaders for our nation, right? Like I would kill for somebody who knows how to has solved problems across difference and build community, right? Over getting an A. So I would just say that we just need to really have our educators, have our parents, have our students recognize that our schools are about producing a new generation of people who are going to contribute to our communities and help us move forward as a nation.
Thank you, David. Matthew.
I actually gave mine a little bit earlier, but yeah, just the same sentiment. I think that I think too, some of our kids are going to be much more resilient than we give them credit for. I know my kids are ready to go back to school. They want to be back in school, and being a 4-month summer break sounds great theoretically, but it really gets a little old after a while. So I do think just being there to embrace our kids is going to be imperative. But I think being prepared for kids who may have come from an experience of the last several months that may not have been supportive, or where parents were still essential workers and weren't there. There's a lot of things to consider, but I think one thing rings true is we just have to be there for our kids in a positive space to build those safe, stable, nurturing relationships. And again, get some consistency back, because we know that breeds unpredictability, and consistency breeds that safety So trying to get back, not necessarily status quo. I don't want to get that confused with consistency. But I think those pieces are going to be imperative.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be with us here today. You talked a little bit about some transformative moments, as well as some very practical advice, I think, for the folks in the audience. I just want to say, a transformative moment for me is when a reporter asked me if it was appropriate to describe empathy as a quote unquote soft skill. And I thought for a moment and I said, it's not a soft skill, it's the skill. That's it. If we don't have that for each other, if students don't have that for themselves, then really we're in a hole we can't get out of. So I really am very pleased to hear all of you, and I've learned a lot during this this time together, and I wanted to say thank you. So thank you to Kathleen Beachford, Matthew Portell, Margaret Beal Spencer, David Adams, and I would like to also once again thank for the invitation from TREP Project to moderate this panel. I wish you a wonderful conference for the remainder of the afternoon. And this recording will be up and available for folks who missed it. And I just wanted to say that in this extraordinary moment for our country and our nation, how much I value and appreciate the hard work that teachers are doing for so many students all over this country and all over the world. So thank you very much. And we're going to close it out there. Thank you, everyone. Great job, folks.